recording, and you may notice that a little recording icon showed up on your screen. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics of scheduling and settings in your Zoom account, some information for before you start your class, and then when you do start your class, we'll go through some of the tools and best practices for using those tools. And then we're going to talk about synchronous and asynchronous classes, and if you don't know what that means, we'll cover that towards the end, as well as we'll talk a little bit about recordings. And then I'll offer some additional resources and training. All right, so I want to hop right on over to the Zoom account. So I hope at this point you've all had a chance to make your own account under mcgill.zoom.us. So over here, you'll see you have this toolbar on the sides, and if you head to settings, you have a couple of setting options. So under meetings, I want to offer you a couple of general suggestions about what are some good default settings to begin with. Once you set these default settings in your settings bar, whenever you schedule a meeting, those will be your default options. You can then change them manually for that particular meeting if you would like to, but otherwise you won't have to go in and change it each time. So this is just convenient to know about. So I'm going to highlight a few that I would recommend. So to keep your host video, so that's your own video off, as well as your participants' videos, that just gives everybody a chance when they arrive to the meeting to decide whether they want their video on or off. You don't know whether maybe you're finishing up a conversation and you want to just have a second, collect yourself, and then turn your own video on. And it's good to offer that courtesy to your students as well. In terms of audio type, I recommend you keep this right at the telephone and computer audio so that if somebody has a problem with the mic on their computer, they have the option to call in. Join before host. So several of you were able to join today's meeting before I was able to join. That's because I had this feature enabled, and it allows you to just hang out waiting till it starts. So just like a real classroom, sometimes your students arrive before you do. I will talk about a situation in which you might not want to have that setting, and I'll talk about that in 1 second. This option, only authenticated users can join meetings. I generally recommend this. It allows you to make a requirement that you have to have a McGill ID or McGill email to be able to join the meeting. Yesterday, we got a few questions about whether if you have guest lecturers or people who don't have McGill IDs. In that case, you want to be mindful that you don't have this setting checked for those particular meetings. Okay. I'm just going to scroll down to a few of the tools. So in terms of chat, there's a couple of options. So I would enable chat. As you are going to see today, it's really useful for asking questions. And I'm going to suggest you also enable file transfer. And again, today I will show you what that looks like to receive a file in the chat. It's just a convenient way to communicate. In terms of private chat and auto-saving chats. So I would recommend auto-saving chats. It's a way for you to then look back over the class and see what questions there were, make sure everything was answered, especially if you're asking students to provide feedback or comments, and that's one way that you're looking at their participation. Private chat allows people to speak privately to someone else in the group. Okay. And then I'm just going to highlight a couple other tools that I think are very useful. So polling, screen sharing, and right here you have a couple of options. So in this setting, everybody has the ability to screen share, but only the host can interrupt someone else's screen sharing. And this is good to know because you don't necessarily want your students to suddenly start sharing something on their screen and interrupt the middle of your lecture. And then annotation, whiteboard, and breakout rooms. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of those tools throughout the rest of the session. So from there, I want to talk a little bit about how you schedule the actual meeting. So you're going to go to schedule a meeting. You'll put in all your information, you'll put in the duration, but one thing to note is that this duration is not going to cut you off. So if you put in an hour and then it turns out you need to go a little bit over, you're not going to get kicked out of the meeting. It is just going to function like a real life classroom. So if your class starts to go over the end time, you might notice people leaving because they have something else to do or somewhere else to be, but you're not just going to suddenly be cut off from your participants, from your students. One thing to highlight is this recurring meeting. So if you are going to be scheduling your classes at the same time each week or day or whenever, this is a useful feature so you don't have to go in and create a new class for each one. And then as you can see, our settings have carried over from the settings that we just set. Right now, I want to just highlight this alternative option. So generally, I recommend this enable join before host. There's just usually, it's a little easier, but you can also do something called enable waiting room. And what this allows you to do is instead of just showing up to the meeting, your participants show up to this virtual space that's a waiting room, and you as the host get a list of all of the participants who have arrived, and then you can let them in either all at once, or you can let them in one at a time, or just a handful of them. And what this can be particularly useful for is office hours. So if you're going to be holding office hours and you want to be able to speak to just one individual at a time, or a group of individuals, say helping them with their group project, this is a useful tool to keep in mind. You do have to decide which one you want checked because they cancel each other out. And then I don't know what would happen. Okay, so once you're ready, you can click Save. And then in order to share the information with your students, you can either add it to the Outlook calendar. You can copy and paste this URL and email it to your students, or post it on My Courses, or you can copy the entire invitation, which is what I would recommend because it has the information for how to access with a telephone. So you just click copy meeting invitation, and then you can paste that in your My Courses or in an email. All right. So I'm just going to look at the chat and see if there's any questions that have come in. Okay, so let's see. So a question about in a synchronous class, do we tell students to keep their video off? So this is a little dependent on the size of the class. If you have, I find that meetings of around 20 have no problem with lag. So if you're somewhere in that range with your students, you can ask students to turn their video on. I do want to encourage you to be mindful about asking students to keep their video on, just because they're now in different locations. They might not actually have the high-speed internet where they are now. They may feel uncomfortable sharing their surroundings. So while you can, if you have a smaller setting, you can invite people to do so, but I would be hesitant to actually mandate it. In terms of, there's a question about how much time can someone go over their scheduled meeting time. That's a good question. I don't know exactly if there's a hard limit. In my experience, you can go a lot over your scheduled time. I've gone about 45 minutes over a scheduled time, but I will check back about that. There's a question about enabling co-hosts, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but right now only the host, so in this case myself, has the option to enable somebody to become a co-host. Okay. Yeah, so there's a question about providing practice sessions. So we are planning to do that. We're working out the logistics of how to schedule those practice sessions, but what the idea is going to be is that you will be placed in groups of 4 to 6, and you will be given the task of hosting the meeting. And this is a way where you can host and practice using these tools with an actual audience. And you'll see why that makes a difference. If you go home and play around on your own, you can get familiar with a lot of the tools, but sometimes it's helpful to actually have some participants to sort of be your guinea pigs. Um, so Corey, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. Could you unmute yourself and ask? Okay, well, if you get a chance, you can ask again.
Okay, you hear me
Okay,
now?
yes, we can hear you.
Sorry. So as you know, they've added Zoom to the default nav bar in My Courses.
Hmm.
So you can actually schedule within My Courses basically what you're walking through Zoom meetings. I'm just wondering, are there any advantages of doing so within My Courses relative to doing it outside, let's say, for example, on the Zoom site?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's any advantages to just doing it directly in My Courses. I think that it's good to be familiar with the Zoom site in case you're scheduling it for things that are not specifically for your class. I'm not sure if My Courses has additional advantages if you just go right through them, but I'll make a note and get back to you on that. That's interesting. Um, okay, so. Uh, there's a question about the saved auto chat. So that's going to save to the host's computer. So I, at the beginning of the session, selected where on my computer I wanted that to save. It's in a file under my documents under Zoom. So that's where all of my uh, uh, Zoom recordings or chats end up. Okay. Um, So in terms of sharing documents on the chat, you can share one document at a time, but you can continue to share multiple documents. So that was a question, and we'll see that in action in a second. So I'm going to go on to our next section. So this, I've just included a quick summary of some of the settings that I went over. I will also say that TLS is working on a nice template, so that'll be helpful for instructors, just that gives you a set of recommended settings. Okay, so I want to talk for a couple of minutes about kind of setting up. So when you're setting up your home classroom, think about how you want students to be able to view you. Make sure that you're not sitting in front of a window, that you're not backlit, so you have a light or a window facing you, because otherwise you'll just be a dark silhouette. A couple of recommendations. So I would suggest turning off notifications for your email or for Teams or whatever else you have that gives you notifications, because otherwise those will show up in your screen if you're sharing your screen, or the sound, students will hear the sound go off. And then I'd also ask students to register or sign in with their full name. So if you're asking for authenticated sign-ins users, then that'll happen automatically because it'll be their McGill ID. But if you're not, just make sure you ask users to put their name, because otherwise it might just be their initials, or it's just helpful to be able to see everybody's name. I suggest you test your video and microphone before starting your first class. And there's a really easy way to do that if you go to zoom.us/test. So if you head over to here, you'll get this option that says join. I'm not going to join right now because it would kick me out of this meeting that we're in together. But if you do join, it'll walk you through a couple of tests to make sure that your microphone and your video is working okay. And you'll notice that next to your microphone and video are little arrows. Those are where you can access any settings and adjust your microphone and video settings. And then I'd recommend, if possible, to use a headset and mic, just because sometimes the microphone on your computer is not as sensitive, or if you're going to be turning your head, it just allows you to pick up the sound a little bit nicer. And then I suggest you prepare your desktop for screen sharing. So we're going to talk more in detail about screen sharing in a minute, but generally close or minimize anything irrelevant. Make sure that you are going to be comfortable with whatever is up there being shared, so you don't have any personal emails that might be embarrassing for your students to see. and that you just have as clear a view as possible. And then if you are using a PowerPoint, I generally suggest that you begin the PowerPoint before you start sharing. I haven't done that today simply because I'm going to be moving back and forth between my PowerPoint and the Zoom account. But it'll just end up having a somewhat clearer view for your students. All right, I'm just going to check the chat. Okay. Okay, so there's a question about my courses, and I'm going to suggest to hold off on any my courses questions, just because right now we're focusing on Zoom. But generally, I will say that on my courses, there's something called My Courses Essentials, which is a helpful tool for walking you through all of the different tools that are available on my courses. And I know that TLS is working on a number of resources for helping instructors who have not been using my courses necessarily. Okay. So moving on, when you begin your class, the first thing that I would suggest you keep in mind is that just as this is new for a lot of you, this is also new for your students. So make sure you take some time to um, introduce your students to the platform, to lay out your guidelines. So if you recall, this morning, I laid out some guidelines about how students can ask questions, how we're going to be using the chat, whether you should keep yourself muted and ask questions in the chat, or whether you should just unmute yourself and interrupt. And that's going to really be up to you and depend on the size of the class that you have and what the purpose of your class is. I do want to highlight a couple of resources that are really great. So I'm going to pull us over to the TLS page. So if you go to Teaching and Learning Services, right at the top, there's this banner, and under Resources for Students, you can guide them, you can direct them to a number of really great strategies that have been developed, as well as some webinars that are going to be hosted. So this is something you can be encouraging your students to explore already. I'm also going to share in the chat a document that's really nice that was created by our own Tatiana Lamoureux-Gauvin. And it's really, it's a helpful guide just that gives everybody a nice breakdown of how to suddenly manage remote learning. I'm sharing it both as a PDF and a Word document. Okay. And I've noticed that sometimes people have a hard time getting the Word document through the chat, so that's why I'm sharing it in both formats. And I think that's because of people's different Word devices. So I'm getting a question about what's being communicated to students to prepare them for Zoom. Are there emails being sent out informing them of the use of Zoom and directing them to resources? Yes. So students are having their own set of communications about how to prepare for remote learning. These webinars are being advertised, and hopefully some students will start attending when they begin tomorrow. But you also, as instructors, can feel free to encourage your students to begin exploring some of these resources. Okay. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk briefly about assigning co-hosts. Oh, sorry, I want to go back and actually talk about participant actions. So as I was talking about with setting guidelines about how you want people to ask questions or participate in the class, one of the nice options that Zoom has are called participant actions. So if you go and look at the little place where you have, it should say participants, and it looks like two little silhouettes of people back to back. If you click on that, you should notice that there's a number of options, including raise hand, lower hand, yes, no, go slower, go faster. So I'm going to give everybody a second to locate those reactions and practice by raising your hand. Great. So I'm seeing lots of hands go up. Um, okay, so this is another option that you can have in your class if you want to have participation look a little different, especially if you have a smaller class or more discussion-based class. You can have people raise their hand and then take stack and just have people unmute themselves and share. So you'll be able to sort of keep track of who's raising their hand and wants to speak. I also suggest you remind them to lower their hand, because otherwise then it just looks like they're constantly wanting to participate. So for those of you who've raised your hand, you can go ahead and start lowering your hand. The yes and the no are also really helpful just for a quick check-in. Often I think people might ask, like, are you all with me? Does this make sense? And you can just get a quick yes, like yes or no. The go slower and the go faster, what those are trying to encourage, they're not actually going to speed you up. That's not possible. But in a real life class setting, you're able to look at your students and kind of pick up on their body language. And, you know, is everybody looking at you like they have no idea what you're talking about? That's a sign to you to start going a little slower and pace yourself a little more. Or does everybody look bored and maybe it's really obvious and you can pick up the pace a little? So obviously in a digital setting, that's a little bit harder. So that's what those buttons are trying to mimic. In the case of this particular semester, I don't encourage using them. This is going to be such a sharp learning curve for everyone that it's a little bit, it's a lot to try to manage all of that. But you can also notice that there are some other participant reactions. So under more, there's the thumbs up, there's clapping, there's a little coffee break. So those are just useful to know about because you might want to incorporate them into your class as a way to encourage student engagement. Okay, so finally I want to talk about assigning a co-host. So we had a question about this before. Um, right now my settings are such that the instructor, the host, is the only one who can assign a co-host. And what this does is it allows somebody else to have the same privileges and view that the host has. So this can be particularly useful if you have a lot of students or a huge class and you want some help navigating the chat and moderating the discussion. So sort of somebody who can help almost in a TA role. And I know a lot of you don't have TAs in your class, but it might be something that maybe you want to partner with a colleague and help each other out in that context. Then the other place where it can be very useful is for group presentations or even individual presentations to allow the student who's presenting to be able to view the participant reactions to facilitate the conversation. Okay, so I'm just going to pull up the chat. So I have a couple of questions. So how did I add the documents to the chat? So under my chat, there's an option that says more, and it allows me to, one of the options is a file transfer. I believe you can create a setting that allows only the host to file transfer or anybody. And I don't recall which I have for this meeting. So there's a question, can we keep track of participation by downloading a list of people who raised their hands? So I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure what after the fact information remains with the participant reactions. I don't think so. We're going to talk about an option that does allow you to save some information in a few minutes called polling. For the purposes of the remainder of this semester, I would suggest just allowing participation to be something that is more easily recordable. So student comments in chat or even discussion posts on my courses. But I will look into that, what you can save in terms of the participant reactions. So there's a question about screen sharing. So we're going to talk about that in a second. Okay. So all right, we're now at what I think are kind of the most exciting parts. There's all of these different tools. And I think these are really where you can start mimicking the feel of a live classroom. So I'm going to start by talking about screen sharing. And right now I'm sharing my screen, and you don't have the option to interrupt my screen sharing with your own screen sharing. So I'm going to show you, if you did click on screen share, what would come up is a window like this, and it gives you three options at the top. So to share your entire desktop, to share your whiteboard, which we'll talk about in a second, or to connect to an external device. So sharing your entire desktop just shares whatever you have out there, which is what I'm doing right now. There's also this option to share specifically by application. And this is really nice if you know that you're only going to be sharing, you only want to share your PowerPoint, say, but you have a lot of other applications open in the background. This way you highlight this particular option, and then you hit share. And so all students will be able to see is the PowerPoint, or whichever application you've selected. In my case today, as I mentioned, I'm moving between PowerPoint and Chrome. So I personally find it easiest to just share my entire desktop. But there is another feature for screen sharing that allows you to pause the view. So I'll show you for a second what that's going to look like. And I did it briefly before. So I've now paused the view, and what you're seeing is the same thing that we had before, but without seeing me actually navigate to the new window, I was able to do it because I had paused the view. So that's a useful feature to keep in mind. So if you want to share specific applications, you can still, of course, switch between different applications. It's just whatever you find is the easiest. So that's really useful to know about screen sharing. The other thing I want to demonstrate is the whiteboard. So this is what's going to mimic a blackboard or a whiteboard. So if you have a lot of board work in your class, this is good to become familiar with. And you can see that what you'll be able to do is write with your mouse, or draw with your mouse. So if you have an iPad and a stylus, this is going to be the most convenient option for you, because it's just actually writing. Otherwise, I suggest, if possible, using an external mouse. I'm using my touchpad today, so you can see it's pretty messy, but it's, the more you practice, the easier it gets. And I'm going to ask all of you to take a second and locate the annotation bar in your toolbar. Okay, and once you've located it, I encourage you to take a second and look at some of the options, and feel free to draw, and you'll see that we can start seeing some drawings appear. Exactly, so Graham just added something. We have a couple other, yeah, so in yesterday's session, people started getting really excited about this option, so I've decided to just encourage you all to play around for for a minute or so. Okay. Great. So while you're playing with that, I'm going to open up the chat. So the annotation bar is going to be found on your toolbar or under view options. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so in my view, it's usually at the bottom of my screen, but I guess for some of you, it's going to be at the top of your screen. And if you're not seeing it, there should be a little 3 dots that say more, and I would click there. There's a question about hyperlinks work, so I'm going to address that in a second. Okay, and one thing to keep in mind with annotating is that I, as the instructor, can disable the ability for users to annotate. So if I find that it's just not very useful, or it's becoming distracting, I can always disable this feature. The nice thing about it is that it's a way for you, if you have problems that you want students to be able to solve on the board or actually demonstrate their work, this is a really useful tool. And you can also, there are settings that allow you to track who's making which screen sharing, who's making which annotation as they make it. So when they make the annotation, it'll briefly flash who did it. I don't have that turned on today. Okay, so I am going to I think we've all gotten a chance. So what I'm going to do is clear all drawings, and we're going to move um, back to my desktop view. So I did have a question about um, sharing links, and this is a really good question that if you're going to be sharing something to a video, what I suggest is instead of actually screen sharing it at the same in this format, to provide the students with the link to the video. And this is just because since everybody is going to be accessing your the tool with different Wi-Fi capabilities, there may be lags for some students and it may just be really choppy. So instead I would say, okay, here's a link to a video. It's about 5 minutes long. We'll reconvene at specifically this time. Or you have them view it ahead of time, depending. It's just a little bit more seamless. And then as always, generally I suggest with YouTube to turn off autoplay or log out entirely from your account, just so that your next recommended video doesn't suddenly start playing. Okay, so I did see one more question come into the chat. So this is a question about sharing whiteboard and slides simultaneously. So if you have, I'm not sure actually if you can do them simultaneously. It's a good question. It's sort of a question if you have a laptop and an iPad. I think there is a workaround, but I want to double check on that. Okay. Okay, so the next tool that I want to highlight is called polls. So this is a really nice way to encourage student engagement, and this is somewhere where you can track student responses. So there's a couple of ways to set up polls. So you can set it up ahead of time when you're creating your meeting, and I'll just show you quickly in a second how to do that. But if you're in the middle of a class session and you want to suddenly ask a polling question, you can create one on the fly. So what that's going to look like is you're going to pull up the poll, ask a question, and then be prompted in your Zoom window to create the poll. You can make the responses anonymous or not. And then you'll type in your question, and you can allow students to select single choices or multiple ones, so that's really useful. And then once you save it, we'll be able to go back, and I'm now going to launch this poll. And so you can see what it's like to take this poll. And as I'm looking at my view, I can see the percent that have voted already. And once you voted, the poll window closes for you. But once it's complete or enough people have responded, I can then share the results with you. So polling is a really nice feature generally in a class, just because it allows you to get feedback live. So you can ask questions just to see how well students are understanding. You can, it's a way for students to also get immediate feedback, because it's a really low stakes way to respond to questions. So I'm going to end right now, and I'm just going to share the results with you. So you can now see that a lot of you already use polling, which is great. So it's really easy to build this into your Zoom class. And the way that you will set it up ahead of time, so if you go back to your meetings and you click on your specific meeting in your Zoom account, at the very bottom is the option to create polls. So you can, ahead of time, add a number of polling questions. And this means that in the middle of the class, you don't have to stop to write your question. You can simply go back to, and it'll give you a bank of questions that you can draw from. Okay, so I'm just going to see. Okay, so there's no new questions on polling. It's a really nice tool. And it's similar to Turning Point, like if you use that in your classes. So the last tool that I want to talk about is Breakout Rooms. So what this is going to allow you to do is mimic your group discussion environment. So I think a lot of you are used to in your class asking a question or giving a problem and saying, okay, turn to a partner and work on this, or in small groups, can you work on a solution to this? So in this large digital setting, you can create breakout rooms, which are going to be small digital subsections where students can share and discuss amongst themselves. So you have two options when it comes to creating breakout rooms. You can pre-assign them when you're scheduling your meeting. So if we go back to our schedule meeting option at the very bottom, under the options, there's an option that says breakout room pre-assign. So if you click this, it allows you to manually say which students you want to be in which room. So if you have groups that have been working together already, this is a way to do that. You'll just keep those groups as is. And you can import a list of your student names so you don't have to type all of them in. The other way to do that is while you're in the midst of the class, if it doesn't matter, it's just a chance to encourage small group discussion, you'll have an option to assign breakout rooms. And what that's going to look like is you'll pull up this window and you'll get the number of participants, and you'll basically decide how many rooms you want to create. So when I was creating this, I only had one participant, and so he was banished to his own breakout room by himself. But based on the number of participants, you can then determine the number of rooms. And so you can say if you want groups of 5, if you want groups of 10, it's really up to you. And then you still have the option to manually assign them, but in the middle of a class, that's going to take a lot of time. So if you are just assigning breakout rooms right in the class as you go, I suggest doing the automatic assigning, which is just going to randomly sort them into the groups that you want. Once you've created the breakout rooms, you'll get this list. And again, I only had one participant, so I only had one room. But if you have more, you'll get a list of all the different breakout rooms that are in progress. And as the host, you can then join them. So this is similar to when you're teaching and you go wander around the room and sort of check in with different groups. This is that same experience. You can pop in and say, how's it going? Do you have any questions? Just sort of check in on the different groups and see where they all are. And then when you want everybody to come back together, you can close the rooms. So we are going to try this right now. I'm going to randomly assign you into breakout rooms. You'll see what it's like to get the prompt to leave the main meeting, to enter into the new breakout room, and I'll pop into one of the rooms at random.
Hi, Leigh. I just want to say that your mic is currently muted.
Thanks so much. Okay, so, I'm so glad that somebody interrupted me to say that. So sometimes that's going to happen when you're coming in and out from the breakout room. And as you can see, that's a really useful chance to interrupt and to turn on your own mic. So the questions that I was just answering, so there was a question about activating polls. So that's something that on the host's view, as the instructor, you have a tool that allows you to begin a poll, which is why we're hosting these practice sessions where you can, you'll be able to see what that's like and ask your colleagues who are your participants for that session. There's a question about whether students can answer poll questions during recordings. I'm not sure about this, so I'm going to get back to you on this question. I'm liking all of these technical questions. There's a question, Reem, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Hi, Leigh.
Yeah.
My question was about when initially you said you can activate the when you set up the meeting, whether the students or the participant can share their screen with you or not. So if I said nobody can share the screen but me initially, when they go to the breakout rooms, because I could see the shares option there because you activated it for us, but will they be able to share with each other? Say, for example, they're working on an exercise and they're trying to share their screens.
Yeah, so that's another great option that you're bringing up. So if you can, in the breakout rooms, you can share your screen. And that's something that in the settings, that's why I recommend you do have the setting that allows all participants to share their screen, but not to interrupt the host, the instructor. So yes, in breakout rooms, you can absolutely share screens. Um, so there's a question about randomly created course groups in my courses being imported into Zoom. I don't think so. I think you would just create the groups randomly in Zoom. And there's a question about students self-selecting into breakout rooms, which is not possible at this point. So that's where you would manually create the rooms based on the groups that you've already established. So if you want to make sure groups are always different, what I would suggest is using the random assign. So that is, it's going to be random. You might have one or two students who are overlapping, and depending on your class size, but it's going to be different each time. So the recorded version of this video, I'm going to talk to the communications team and figure out where it makes the most sense to place this. There's a question about leaving the breakout room before the end of the time. Yes, you can. So you'll notice that when I ended the breakout room, you should have gotten a message that said your room is going to close in 60 seconds. At any point, you could have left. And then when the room closes, you still have to leave the room. As the host, I have a view of who has joined their room and who hasn't. So I can see whether people are, I can see in the main meeting who hasn't left the meeting. But I can just sort of have a quick view of who's in the room and who's not. Okay, great. So there's a question about sending private messages to multiple people. No, you have to send it to one person at a time. Okay, so yeah, thanks. So you can actually import specific groups if you do it with that CSV file. Yeah, so there's a question about saving class presence and participation. So there's a record of who joined the class and who the polling results as well. So that is information you can have as well as the chat at the end. Okay, great. So I want to talk briefly just about the difference between the ways that you can be thinking about hosting your class. So in the beginning, I talked about synchronous or asynchronous classes. So a synchronous class is what we're doing now. So we're all coming together at the same time, and it's a live class experience. What's nice about this option is that it more closely mimics the classroom feel. You're all there at the same time. It allows for a live engagement, so you can use the tools that I've been talking about, like polls or chatting or the breakout rooms. So those are really nice features about the synchronous class setting. The disadvantage is that it's going to be very challenging for students who are now across the globe and in different time zones. They're all over the place. It's also a little bit challenging because we're all now working from home. Some of us are going to have kids or pets, or in my case, my neighbor has decided to start doing construction. So it can be challenging to hold a synchronous class when you have all of these distractions. The asynchronous class is where you're essentially going to create recordings and then share them, and students will view them on their own time. And then you're not meeting live. What's nice about this is that it accommodates students who are in different time zones. It allows you the flexibility of making the recordings at a time when your kids are taking naps or you just have a little bit more space in your own home. Students are able to rewatch the challenging content, so that's a really nice option. And you can still engage students with discussion posts or with quizzes. So it's not completely, it doesn't lack engagement, it's just a different type of engagement. So what I recommend for this semester, just given the fact that this is such an unusual situation that we all find ourselves in, is that as much as possible to opt for recordings, so asynchronous options. This is going to depend a lot on what your class is going to look like for the last 2 weeks. If you have a case discussion, it may be a lot more challenging to do the recordings, or if it's a really small, just discussion-based seminar-style class, that's going to really be quite difficult with recordings. But if it's possible to think about ways that you could do the recordings, just because that's going to make things a lot easier for both you and your students. That being said, if you are planning to do the recordings, I still would encourage you to do a quick synchronous session with just as a chance to touch base with your students, just to see where they are, to give them the chance to ask any questions about how the remainder of the semester is going to go, to familiarize themselves with the tool, and to give a little bit of a sense of community, which I think is really important in this time. And then if you are doing the synchronous classes, I do suggest you try to record them anyway, and then you can post them to My Courses. If you're doing this, make sure that you inform students and let them know that they're being recorded. So if they would like to keep their videos off, that's an option for them, just to protect their privacy. If you're going to be doing the recordings, what I recommend is doing them in short clips. So if you, instead of doing the hour-and-a-half lecture altogether, break it up into 15 to 25-minute segments, obviously based around a topic. Or theme or content. And the reason for that is just that for students who don't have access to high-speed internet, this will be a little bit easier for them to access a shorter clip rather than having to download or stream a longer clip. And then finally, what I suggest for this term is that as much as possible to share resources with other instructors. We've all been thrown into this crazy situation. If you're teaching a core course, you might want to get in touch with the other instructors and figure out a way for one of you to take one topic for the remainder of the class and semester and make recordings based on that. We had a question in one of the town halls last week whether you can use recordings from other instructors or other instructors at other institutions, and the answer is yes, as long as you have their consent and you give credit. So that's something to just think about. So it's really about kind of managing this situation. Moving forward, as we become more comfortable with remote instruction and with these online tools, these suggestions will change, but this is just for managing the rest of this semester. I see there's a question in the chat, so I'm going to pull that up. Okay, so there's a question about recording, so I'm actually going to talk about that right now. So I'm going to hop on over to my Zoom page, and under the settings, you can see that we looked at the meeting settings, but there's also recording settings. And what you'll notice is that there are a couple of options here. So there's the option to record locally, which is going to create a file on your computer, which you would then manually upload into My Courses. There's also the option for cloud recording. And what this is this is accessible for people who have the Zoom Pro license. So all instructors this term have that license and can do this cloud recording. TLS and IT are busy working on a way that the cloud recording will allow you to automatically populate your recordings in My Courses, so you won't have to manually upload anything. And they're working on a way so that the recordings will be streamed through My Courses. So rather than it be a distinct file that students potentially download, it would be a streaming option. I'm not sure on the timeline of that, of when that's going to become available. In the next few days, it'll definitely be available. If you want to get started on your recordings, you absolutely can, and that's where you can still record to the cloud, or you can still do local recording. You would just have to manually upload to My Courses. One thing I want to point out is that there is this option that hosts can give permission to participants to record locally. So if any of you try recording right now, you'll get a message that asks for permission, that asks you to ask me for permission to record. So this is something that you can keep checked or unchecked depending on what your options are, what you want students to be able to do. I'm going to pull up the chat because I see another question coming in. So, so there's a question about using Zoom for final presentations. So this is something we talk a little bit in the guidelines for changing assessments. I think you can use Zoom for final presentations, but again, being very mindful that students are in these different time zones. And so there may be situations when you're asking students to present at 3 a.m. I also suggest that if you are going to be asking students to do that, you make sure to build up to these presentations. So in your first class on March 30th, you don't suddenly jump into the student presentations. You give students a chance to familiarize themselves with this new experience. Again, there are a couple of other suggestions in terms of how to handle presentations moving forward. So you can have students simply submit their slides. You can have them do a voice capture over their PowerPoint slides. So they are essentially saying what they would say, and then they can just upload that to My Courses. And they can have that uploaded in a way that other students can view and comment on. And so you can still have student engagement with the participations, but you're not necessarily asking them to meet synchronously and not necessarily over Zoom. But you can still have them do the presentations. And in that case, I would suggest making them co-hosts so that they can share their screen and they can facilitate the conversation. Okay, so I want to end by just pointing out a couple of other resources. So we shared in an email a few days ago a guide for getting started that Giselle Dubois created. It's really nice. I'm going to post this again in the chat just so that you have this guide. And I also want to, and that offers some additional resources in addition to Zoom. It talks about My Courses, and it talks about some general just nice reading about this particular moving online quickly. I want to point out where there are some other really great resources. So again, under Teaching and Learning Services, if you go into this disruption to classes, there's a set of resources for instructors. So you can see there's a number of upcoming webinars. This is a very general about teaching remotely and redesigning assessments. There's also all of these guides. So this is going to be really helpful in terms of going through at a slower pace and just finding the resources and the answers to questions that you have. So you can see that under each of these categories, there's a number of information, a number of points of information that you can access. I'm also going to be hosting the practice sessions, so we'll send out more information about how to schedule that. But as I've mentioned, this is going to be a chance to go through and be the host, so to have actual participants, so students, where you can view what the host views, you can practice putting people in breakout rooms, you can practice navigating the chat. And then, of course, feel free to reach out to online-courses.mgmt for any general questions or for support. I also know that the help desk is going to be working overtime for Zoom. It's going to really be, if you have technical issues or technical questions, that's going to be where I would suggest going right away, and they'll help you with that. So I just want to conclude with a couple of takeaways. So I can't stress this enough. This semester is, I mean, the whole world is in a state of upheaval. Be flexible, be forgiving on both yourself and your students. This is not going to be the chance to suddenly become a pro in online teaching. This is going to be a chance to just get used to it, to get going and move from there. take some time to practice with the new tools, come to the practice sessions or attend a TLS webinar, reach out to your colleagues, and then finally I suggest really sharing resources as much as possible. So I'm going to just take one more look at the chat and see if there's any other questions. Yeah, so if you haven't gotten any files in the chat, then I'm going to see if I'll send it as a Word as well. Yeah, so if you look in the guide for getting started, there's a lot of webinars coming out of the Harvard Business School specifically about Zoom and everything. All right, great, and feel free to continue to reach out as well. And when I have, when I find out where we're going to post this recording and the slides, I'll let you all know. All right, great. Well, I'm going to close this meeting off, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye.